Why is Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, using a reality TV analogy to insist he's not trying to replace the Prime Minister? And why has speculation about Keir Starmer's future gone into overdrive anyway? We'll discuss on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And it is Alex in her makeshift home studio.
Good, sounding great.
It is, yeah.
And there, got a special mic.
I think, actually, Chris, this is one of those stories where rather than just like diving in with the latest lines, as we would normally do on the news, it's worth kind of winding the clock back a bit to the old world of Wednesday evening. And just where did this all start?
Well, it started earlier than that. So, look, I'm going to do one of those things, and I know this might be sort of mildly irritating to newscasters, really, but just very briefly as a sort of reminder of how the sort of Westminster journalism thing works, because I know this can feel like, oh, you know, people have whispered to reporters and ... and people like me may be sounding quite excitable, etc., etc. So in the way that we in our normal lives don't operate entirely on the record all of the time, in other words, tell everyone we bump into exactly what we think in the most candid terms, because we'd all be finished before the day was out if we did it, there is a convention within Westminster that politicians will do stuff on the record in front of a camera or a microphone or something where they are going to be quoted verbatim. And then they'll have other conversations that are off the record where they know their sentiments will be reflected or could be reflected, but their identities will be protected. And that is a two-way process, and it means that we can bring you a greater sense of what is really going on, and they can be more candid than they would be if they had a camera under their nose. So I spend every morning that I'm at Westminster drinking endless cups of tea in the company of all sorts of different political figures, having these kind of off-the-record conversations. Every day I do that. And yesterday I was doing it as normal, and some of those conversations added up to me thinking, oh, this is interesting. This is those who have, they think, the Prime Minister's interests at heart, wanting to say something quite bold about his outlook, about the threats that they perceive from within the party to his leadership. And so I was told that the Prime Minister was of the view that were he to be challenged for the leadership, he would fight, he would stand in that contest. He wouldn't be persuaded to retire to a nice spot in the Lake District and not be seen politically again. In other words, this was people who want to secure his leadership saying to those potential contenders and Labour MPs who worry that he's not up to the job, look, however bright and shiny the alternative leadership in your mind on that hill might be, there is a trudge through rather boggy, murky ground between now and then, because this would involve a leadership race, which would happen when the party was in government and would look potentially spectacularly self-serving and or sort of not focused on the priorities of the public, etc., etc. So that's where, in its first instance, this emerged out from, and where, if you like, the iceberg of the questions that Labour face around its government and its leadership popped up above the waterline again.
And then we'll come to the Wes Streeting angle in a second. But Alex, sources close to the Prime Minister are telling people like Chris that couple of sentences on the surface might seem like, well, yeah, of course, if there was a leadership contest, oh, right, yeah, Keir Starmer would fight it. But actually, you don't have to dig very far to then see lots of implications of that statement, which actually don't necessarily make Keir Starmer look strong.
No, completely right. And the context of this is key, because I think obviously a couple of points. It might have felt to people who were just looking at the newspaper headlines or watching Chris on the telly last night that this kind of came out of the blue, because, you know, it's not like in the past couple of days publicly there's been like this really active chat about Keir Starmer and his immediate future. Behind the scenes, obviously, there have been lots of conversations, not least because of where the current Labour government and Keir Starmer specifically sit in terms of popularity, i.e. they're not very popular, according to the polls. So there have been lots of conversations about, you know, what next for Keir Starmer and is he the right leader? But it was quite extraordinary that this seemed to be a kind of very deliberate, quite pointed, fairly coordinated message that the insiders in Number 10 wanted to land about this. And obviously the consequence of that is, while they might have wanted it to look like, actually be careful what you wish for if you're thinking about getting rid of Keir Starmer, because it might be tricky if you do, what it's actually done is just now opened up widely the conversation about Keir Starmer and his future. And it's almost, the other side of this is like an admission from within the number 10 operation, albeit the Prime Minister said it wasn't sanctioned by him, but from within the number 10 operation, that there is a question around Keir Starmer's leadership. And, that is not a good look for a Prime Minister.
It's absolutely an admission and an acknowledgement of perceived weakness. And then also, and I must admit, I didn't know this at the time that I was having these conversations, is that it was clearly coordinated, because as the day went on yesterday, there were others reporting very similar things to what we were reporting. So what did we hear? We heard a podcast and a article in the Times, which had a similar kind of thrust to it. And then along came, after Patrick Maguire's piece in the Times, along came a piece from Pippa Crerar in the Guardian, and there was a piece on Bloomberg as well. And then in the mix of all of that, because Wes Streeting's name had been dropped into these conversations, came the news that Wes Streeting was doing the broadcast media round this morning on the Today programme and Breakfast TV and Good Morning Britain, etc., and therefore would be confronted by these questions in which he would have to profess, at least some loyalty, and he would argue full loyalty to the Prime Minister.
But Chris, how did it go from, if there was a leadership challenge, Keir Starmer would stand and fight and hopefully win, to, and Wes Streeting is the guy who's going to challenge him? Join those two dots for us.
Well, I mean, from the conversations that I had, so I'll talk about the conversations I had first and then broaden it out into what others have reported. So in the conversations that I had, the principal message was around the whole question of the Prime Minister's determination and willingness to fight, and how, in their view, it would be complete madness for him to be challenged, because it would jeopardise the markets might react negatively, and what about the relationship with Donald Trump, etc., etc. But into that conversation was inserted, not by me, references in particular to Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary. It is also true, by the way, and we should say, that there are others, senior figures in the party with leadership ambitions, and it is not purely Wes Streeting. Oh, and by the way, we should say this. I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again. There's nothing ignoble about having an ambition to be Prime Minister.
There's always going to be an ex-person.
Yeah. And every political party all the time asks questions, sometimes publicly and always in private, about who the next leader is going to be, even when a leader is perceived to be walking on water and hugely successful. And so
which has been a while.
Which has been a while for almost all of the parties for quite a while. But those conversations go on, and they absolutely go on when the party and or the government, and in particular the leader, is the evidence suggests not particularly popular. But yeah, so there was this element of kind of, if you like, coordination, and there was this particular focus on Wes Streeting ahead of this round of interviews that he did, with the intention, I think, of attempting to deal with the potential short-term risk that was perceived around the Prime Minister's leadership, and with the aim that nothing actually happens as a result. That was certainly the aim. No, but the consequence of it, at least in the short term, is that we're talking about the vulnerability of the Prime Minister's leadership.
And then the next stage of the journalistic process on Wednesday night was an official on-the-record comment from a spokesperson for Wes Streeting saying he's got nothing to do with this, he's got no ambitions. And then, Alex, that gives it even more oomph, because that's another thing happening on the record that makes all of this feel more real than just people chatting over cups of tea.
Yeah, and whether it was by design or by accident, it was also then Wes Streeting who was lined up, as Chris has said, to do the kind of round of morning interviews where he was meant to be talking about changes to the NHS. But of course, what he ends up talking about is this. And he came in obviously with some lines that he'd thought of in advance, which is entirely normal. Good politicians do it. But one of those was that celebrity traitors line, where he was sort of saying, that this is kind of the worst attack on the faithful since, what's his name? Joe. You'll remember Adam.
Joe Marler.
Yeah, come on, Adam. Yeah,
Joe Marler.
Thank you. Was knocked out the traitors. So he was then found himself completely consumed by having to, as Chris said, express his loyalty to the Prime Minister and say that he wasn't interested in the leadership challenge, which then gave it even more legs. And I think it's worth just, again, sort of, obviously parties go through this, and think about the Conservatives in the tail end of the last government, when there were fairly regular leadership challenges and changes, quite often played out in public in a way that did ultimately prove to be really damaging for the party. But you've got to remember that this conversation, A, has burst into the public because of what somebody in number 10 has been briefing out to very senior journalists, which is why it's become such a public conversation. B, it's happening only 15, 16 months since Keir Starmer won a huge majority, which gives you a sign of some of the feeling and emotion that's happening within the party. And see, beyond that, I think the fact that, and this is what government ministers themselves argue, the fact they are now having to talk about this and address this themselves is problematic in and of itself, because obviously there are a lot of people out there thinking, I'd like to see what you're doing about public services. I'd like to see what you're doing about NHS. I'd like to see what you're doing about schools. I don't want to be hearing about this. The reason we're talking about it is because, of course, it does matter to have an effective government that can command authority, not least of their own parliamentarians. So it does matter to have the conversations. But this seems to be something that was instigated within the Downing Street operation. And what it also allows then is Keir Starmer's critics, and we heard it from Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservatives, during Prime Minister's questions, able to say, look, if you're saying you didn't authorise this briefing, then are you in control of the number 10 operation? And of course, that is a significant question for a Prime Minister running a country as well.
And that is how that conversation played out at midday at Prime Minister's Questions.
These attacks came from number 10, nowhere else, his toxic number 10. The person responsible for the culture in number 10 is his Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney. Does the Prime Minister have full confidence in him?
Morgan McSweeney, my team and I are absolutely focused on delivering for the country. And let me be clear, of course, Mr Speaker, I've never authorised attacks on Cabinet members. I appointed them to their posts because they're the best people to carry out their jobs. And Mr Speaker, she asks about waiting lists. Waiting lists are down under this government. The number of GPs is up. And because we've scrapped NHS England, we're investing on the front line. That's what the Health Secretary is doing today, getting on with his job, and he's doing a very good job too.
Mr Speaker, I didn't hear him give full confidence to Morgan McSweeney. But the truth is, he says these attacks aren't authorised. That means he's lost control of number 10, because that's where they're coming from.
So, Chris, that then takes the story into the territory where we've been in before of people saying to Keir Starmer, well, are you actually in charge of your own people in your own building?
Yeah, and a PMQs that was, I think, probably in the sort of genre of, and newscasters will have a view as to whether this is something they like or not, of old-fashioned political knockabout. I mean, right from the start of PMQs, when a Conservative MP called Lincoln Jopp made a reference to I think his time in the military in an African country some time ago that was suffering a coup.
Sierra Leone.
He attempted. Thank you for the specific, and excuse my sort of broad brush there. A continent of many countries. Trying to make a sort of jokey parallel between that and the Prime Minister's political predicament.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks about remembrance? I particularly remember in 1997 in West Africa, where I somehow managed to survive a bloody and violent attempted coup. So if the Prime Minister wants any ideas about how to do that, he only has to ask.
And the Prime Minister sort of smiling in acknowledgement of all of this. I think, look, those who went about talking to folk like me and others would have been aware that it would cause a bit of short-term political kerfuffle, but they hope that into the medium and longer term it has a value. But in the end, what he's doing, as I say, is highlighting and illustrating what is really going on, the conversations that are going on within the Labour Party and within the government, and and how they wrestle with trying to frankly, be more popular. That's at the root cause of all of this, and how they face up to the challenge posed by Reform UK and others, because there is an ongoing sense within the government, including at a senior level, that at the moment they're simply not doing well enough. And then some people join the dots beyond that and say, perhaps that's because of the guy at the top.
And we're now at the stage where this is spiralling out in all sorts of different directions. And you've got, for example, some people on the Labour left or the former Labour left saying, oh, this is actually a plot by the Labour right, Alex, to actually help Wes Streeting.
Yeah. I mean, follow this if you can. Yeah. But if the intention of the initial briefing was to try and kind of neuter any potential leadership challenge that they believe there may or may not be coming down the line quite quickly, even after the budget, the risk of that is that obviously it inflames the conversation around leadership, as we've discussed. If the intention was to try and neuter Wes Streeting as a potential leadership challenger, even though he's very clearly said today that he's not in that market right now and that he's supportive of the Prime Minister. If that was the attempt, the risk of that is what you do is you hold up Wes Streeting against Keir Starmer, and you sort of almost frame Wes Streeting as a potential future leader of the party. So do you end up exacerbating the conversations around that? And the backdrop to all of that is Labour, like many parties, have different groups and groupings within it. And there will be people, because of the unpopularity that the government currently finds itself encountering, and because we know there are some key inflection points. So the budget, coming up, really big moment for the government. And then those elections in May next year, Scotland, Wales and councils in England, which could be a very difficult moment for the government if they don't do well. There are those active conversations about the party's direction of future. And what the risk of this strategy, again, is that you turbocharge those conversations within the party. So I think, whatever the intention behind this briefing, it's come with a clear risk that it could backfire on some of those other fronts. And they are the conversations that are happening across the party right now.
And Chris, this could have turbo boosted either MPs who were loyal-ish and today are deciding to not be so loyal because they don't like how this is played out, which is dangerous for Keir Starmer. And then some of those potential leadership contenders who might have been prepared to sit and wait till after the elections might be seeing all of this and going, oh, actually, I'm tempted to maybe go a bit earlier.
Possibly. I mean,
this is all a theoretical, of course.
I mean, I think all of these are sort of viable theories. The thing I take away as we record at 2:00 on Wednesday afternoon, the very fact I'm putting a timestamp on it gives you some sense of the sort of febrile. Febrile is such a cliche, but it's also helpfully true. Is that in its own way, of course, this is a moment for us as newscasters to reflect on the conversations I and others have been having and bringing that to you. But for those within the Labour Party, this has been real for ages. I guess the last time we were reporting it with a certain element of sort of frequency or gusto was during the party conference, because there was an element where it kind of, the iceberg was above the waterline then. But the nature of news is that, our limited attention span scatters from one thing to the next. Prisons last week, BBC at the beginning of this week, this now, etc., etc. And of course, lots of these issues are rolling along in the background, some distance from the front pages or the podcast feeds, etc., all the time to a greater or lesser extent. And certainly this question for the Labour Party about its popularity and its leadership and what might happen as a result of it in the short, medium or longer term has not gone away at all, and those conversations are happening all the time. Now, as I say, the aim of those doing some of this talking was to prevent, at least in the short term and maybe into the medium term, some sort of challenge to the Prime Minister. But it doesn't mean the conversations will stop. It may or may not have a bearing on somebody deciding to stick their head above the parapet any time soon. I mean, I was speaking to one wise Labour soul in the last half hour or so who has seen and observed these sort of things happening within their party and others before, and was of the view that these sort of briefings only happen when a significant risk is perceived. Now, that may be a reasonable, and this is where perception is reality, if you like. In other words, there's the sense that this was judged to be a sufficiently vulnerable moment that it was better to have some conversations than not. Yeah. Now, whether that turns out to be, whether that A, was the case, B, turns out to have been a wise course of action are both open questions. But what they allow us to do as reporters and bring to you as newscasters is a sense of the machinations, the conversations, the concerns, the campaign. I mean, I hesitate to use the word sort of campaigning, plotting, etc., because they're sort of capital letter words that can often have a greater sense of significance or sort of, infrastructure attached to them than is perhaps perhaps the case. But those conversations and that concern is absolutely real.
And it's worth saying that those conversations aren't exclusive to the Labour Party by any stretch of the imagination. They happen across all parties. It's kind of part of politics that there are conversations about leadership and do we think they're in the right place and are we really chuffed with the way that things are going. It's obviously the fact that this has been brought out into the public at this point for the Labour government, just a couple of weeks away from a really crucial budget that really matters. But just a quick aside, and I don't want to get too wonky or in the bubble around all this, but I know that newscasters don't mind a little bit of that. But I think the other bit of this is that what it will also do, and has done, is renew those questions about the Downing Street operation. And we've already seen from Keir Starmer that he's had to reset, in his words, the way that things work in Downing Street time and again during the course of the last 15, 16 months or so. Some might say that's just bedding into the running of government. But, it's been quite notable that he has had to shift personnel around and bring other people in and shift other people out. And I think now, because Keir Starmer said he didn't sanction these briefings, and there's all this introspection in Labour about how exactly this came about, and was this the right strategy, and has this done damage, and all the rest of it, it's again going to turn a bit of fire on that number 10 operation. And the number 10 operation is crucial to the effective running of a government.
And just a quick sentence on that broader point, Alex, about other parties. There is a parallel and almost to the same time frame conversation going on privately within the Conservative Party about Kemi Badenoch, with a timeline that extends less so to the budget, because obviously it's the government's budget and not the opposition's, but absolutely towards those devolved elections in Scotland and Wales and English local elections in May of next year, where the Conservatives also expect it to be a rough old time for them, and where there are questions about whether or not the party will want to hold on to its leader, the other side of those contests. So there is a parallel and not dissimilar set of conversations going on around exactly these same themes within the Conservative Party.
This is now going to be a slightly weird parallel, but I hope it makes sense. At moments like this, I'm always reminded of the night that finally did for Liz Truss at the end of her premiership. And you remember it was chaos in the House of Commons about what the whipping instructions were. In other words, how Conservative MPs were meant to vote on a particular vote about wind farms, right? And it was chaos and it was confusing.
Most extraordinary night I've ever had in the House of Commons.
But well, yeah, absolutely. But to an outsider, it seemed a bit mystifying. And actually, is this really that big a deal? And actually, it was just an episode that then led to the end for Liz Truss. Yeah. And so I just mean that moments that seem mystifying when you're not at Westminster full time, hint me, can actually be incredibly significant for the people who are there. That's just what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, look,
not comparing these two moments.
I mean, we shouldn't. We absolutely shouldn't compare the two. But what I remember being in the thick of it that night in the House of Commons, and the overriding, and very rarely is it as crystal clear as it was that night, but the overriding conclusion that night amid the chaos, and it really was chaotic, was that the government was utterly dysfunctional. And to a degree that I have never, ever seen before or since, by the way. So this is why this is not remotely a comparison. And given that visible, audible, transparent dysfunction in the context at the time of a leader who was in a dire political predicament, it became clear to me that night, and I said so on the air, that that the end was nigh. And sure enough, very quickly it was. Now, as I say, there is no comparison with where we are now, but it is a useful illustration, Adam, because it's these moments where, now that night, the iceberg was so far above the waterline, it was sort of Himalayan in height. That is not the case now, but it's why these moments are worth marking and do matter, even if in isolation they can appear I don't know, Westminster chit chat is
not the biggest deal in the world.
Does it really matter? And what is there to see? Because there wasn't much to see that night, because it was happening away from the cameras principally. And that's the job of political journalism, to try and explain that.
Right, well, that's where we are at 13 minutes past 2. Chris, thank you very much.
Ta-ra.
And Chris will be joining us for the 25-hour podcast-a-thon. I think actually at the very beginning and hopefully at the very end too. But hopefully you'll be tuning into the whole thing. And actually you're going to join us as well at some point, aren't you, Alex?
Yeah, I'm going to pop up, as it were. Yeah, I'll be in Salford, but I will join you to give you the stamina you need.
Thank you very much. One last thing to catch up on, the latest on the BBC impartiality stuff. That came up at Prime Minister's Questions as well, and it was brought up by Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader, who's been launching a staunch defence of the BBC, although some people might say it's more a very staunch offence against Donald Trump, because they think that's a good territory for the Lib Dems to be on. Here is his first question to Keir Starmer at lunchtime.
Great British institution is under attack from a foreign government. President Trump is trying to destroy our BBC. Not because he cares about the truth, but because he doesn't want to get away with his lies. Trump has undermined press freedom in America. Now he's trying to do the same here, disgracefully egged on by the leader of reform. So will the Prime Minister tell President Trump to drop his demand for $1 billion settlement from the BBC? And will he guarantee that President Trump will not get a single penny from British licence fee payers?
Let me be clear. I believe in a strong and independent BBC. Some would rather the BBC didn't exist. Some of them are sitting up there. I'm not one of them. In an age of disinformation, the argument for impartial British news service is stronger than ever. And where mistakes are made, they do need to get their house in order, and the BBC must uphold the highest standards, be accountable and correct errors quickly. But I will always stand up for a strong, independent BBC.
So yeah, Alex, so Starmer there mounting a very stout defence of the BBC, but not so stout that he then attacks Donald Trump on the BBC's behalf.
No, and I think this was very much part of, you're right, that Ed Davey has been one of the vocal supporters of the BBC in recent days, but this is also very much plays into the Lib Dem anti-Donald Trump strategy, because the belief in the party is there's quite a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, they believe there's quite a lot of voters in the UK that don't like Donald Trump. And so the Lib Dems have really been leaning into their sort of vocal criticism of Donald Trump. And today, Ed Davey sort of did the double. So he managed to form a question which followed their strategy of being critical of Donald Trump with this accusation that there was foreign interference in the BBC and asking the government to step in and all the rest of it. And at the same time, his vocal support of the BBC. And Keir Starmer clearly didn't want to be drawn into that. So he did give his support to the corporation, but didn't go as far as to wade in around Donald Trump. I don't think you would have expected him to, because, of course, you know, the government minister trying to get involved in a legal wrangling between the US president and the BBC would obviously be quite difficult territory. So I think he was, you know, quite happy just to leave it to his support for the BBC.
And then there was a follow-up question from Ed Davey, which focused on a particular member of the board at the BBC, and that's Sir Robbie Gibb, who was Theresa May's Director of Communications, and before that was a boss here at the BBC. And he was appointed by the previous Conservative government to that post on the board, because that's what governments are allowed to do. And here's what Ed Davey said about Sir Robbie Gibb.
But President Trump's not the only one, Mr. Speaker. The last government spent years undermining the BBC's independence and impartiality. They put two Conservative cronies on the BBC board. One has had to resign, the other's still there, but he's been repeatedly accused of interfering in editorial decisions and staff appointments. Robbie Gibb should have no role in appointing the next Director General. And given the Royal Charter gives the government the power to remove him, will the Prime Minister sack him now?
Mr. Speaker, I certainly agree with the comment that the last government undermined the work of the BBC. They undermined pretty well everything they did in 14 years. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to go into the individual runnings of the BBC. I'm a strong supporter of the BBC in the terms I've already set out.
And yeah, I suppose, Alex, that's the same again. That's Ed Davey trying to score some political points for the Lib Dems, and the Prime Minister saying, well, hang on, the BBC is independent of the government, so his powers to intervene, even if he wanted to, when it came to personnel, are limited.
Yeah, which is also what we heard from Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, because she was answering a lot of questions about this in the Commons on Tuesday, when there were lots of views from MPs, different views about the BBC and the rights and wrongs of it and how it handled the whole situation. But the Lib Dems for a couple of days now have been sort of targeting, or focusing is probably a better way of explaining it, some of their criticism on the role of Robbie Gibb on the BBC board. But both Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, and we heard it again from Keir Starmer there, the Prime Minister, clearly don't want to be drawn into that element of it either. And I think what's also interesting is that Keir Starmer was very much echoing the sentiment that we've heard from other senior ministers in recent days, including Lisa Nandy, when he was saying that he did, you know, completely support the BBC and the fact that it exists and there's got to be a strong and independent BBC and all the rest of it. But they're also making, as we've heard from Lisa Nandy, this idea that there have been mistakes made. So you know, not suggesting there haven't been problems in the BBC that do need to be addressed, sort of trying to recognise that, as well as giving his kind of fundamental support to the existence of the organisation, as it were.
And just one other BBC related thing. It's actually from earlier on in the week, and it was Nigel Farage's press conference on Monday, where he was actually talking about what reform would do for small businesses. And he was asked about the BBC thing, and he said he came out on Donald Trump's side and said that the editing of the panorama was terrible. He did his usual thing of saying the BBC needs to be smaller and cost people less and maybe be a bit more optional rather than compulsory for everyone with a TV to pay their license. But then he was also quite effusive with his praise for things like the World Service and also the fact that the BBC was a big British brand. And I thought that was another example of Nigel Farage kind of moving a bit more to the middle, well, the relative middle for him.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because obviously, as you've been talking about, and newscasters would be familiar with at this point in this conversation about the BBC and its future, obviously the BBC is free or meant to be free from kind of, direct political influence, but it's a huge political issue at the same time, not least because we've got the charter renewal process going on, which works out, what the BBC's for in future and how all of that's going to work. And I think for Nigel Farage, for example, I think there is this sort of idea that he has been vocal in his criticism of what he sees as bias at the BBC for many years, and he repeated that again. But I think they also recognise there are people that if you take like some of the cultural aspects of the BBC, and the big hitting programs like Strictly or Traitors or sports coverage or whatever it is, and this idea of the sort of Britishness of the BBC, it's like he wanted to embrace that side of it as well, so it's like this kind of this notion that there's a recognition that for some people the BBC might be quite an important thing, for others it absolutely won't be, and they won't like it at all. But it was like he was sort of trying to recognize that as well as his clear criticism about some of the news coverage as he would see it. So I reckon that we might be talking about this for a bit yet,
I think so, especially as that charter is not renewed till the end of 2027.
Exactly. Yeah. There's
almost like it's going to be a bit of a marathon.
like
a long thing. Yeah, exactly.
Something that requires some focus and stamina and perseverance.
And endless talking until the clock stops.
Good
Anyway,
practice for you.
Thank you, Alex. Lovely to catch up with you today. Looking forward to seeing you at various points on the podcast-a-thon. Thank you in advance for your support, comfort, company, and lots of words.
And good luck in advance. I have every faith.
Thank you.